You know, yesterday I had the opportunity in Chicago to interview Congressman Bill Foster. And Bill, as he lets everyone know, is the only PhD physicist in the Congress. You're, I guess, the only PhD mathematician, and he has like he wants to basically have the whole market, but I guess you share the market of sort of scientifically oriented folks in the Senate, or in the Congress. So very nice to meet you. Do you have any comments for Bill about the PhD world?
Well, there are things between physicists and mathematicians, but we love each other and we try to get along.
Great. Well, yeah, I asked this in terms of, you know, Mark Warner had been a CEO of a company. You had worked at national laboratories. You have a sense of science and math, you know, what's going on out there. You run companies yourself before you came to Congress. And I am interested in this tension between what we're talking about in terms of the commercial imperative to grow, build, take advantage of things that are not out there, which I think the tech community in Silicon Valley has. And then what are the blind spots and what are the deficits in terms of public interest? And so take your congressman hat off for a minute. As you look at it as a businessman, as a scientist, what do you think from that perspective needs to be fixed?
Well, the thing that business likes the most, and I was in business for 25 years, is that you want some predictability. For example, we created windmills, wind energy technology. Some of these things would take a 2-year lead time. You need to have permits. You need to get financing. So you need to know have some predictability about what was going to be in the horizon a couple of years ahead. And that's kind of one of the things that we're missing right now, especially in tech. And I've been in Silicon Valley recently, and the tech leaders were pretty clear. They wanted federal intervention. They wanted federal legislation so that they'll have some predictability about what to expect in the coming years.
So they want a law. What took them so long to get there?
Well, let me tell you a story, Steve. Several years ago, I was in Silicon Valley. I met with some of the biggest companies, and their message to me was clear. It says, you guys in the federal government, get out of our way. You guys are a problem. You're going to make things worse. Get out of our way. And then a year later, the European Safe Harbor Act came about, and they called me and said, you know, Congressman, we need your help. So I think they have seen the playing field change, and they want to be a part of the discussion instead of a part of the. They say if you're not on the table, then you're on the menu, and I think they got that message pretty clearly.
Now, you're a legislator from California, and California apparently has the Zinger Law that has much of the tech community concerned, might become, in by osmosis, the law of the land. Do you support what California has done on its own as a standard, or would you change it in terms of a federal approach to privacy and data?
Well, I was glad to see that California stepped up to the plate. It was kind of a rush job, and I understand exactly why that happened. And I think everyone expects to see some changes in the law in the next few months or next year or so. It's not going to be implemented until 2020. So we have some time, but looking at it from a federal perspective, I think it's a good starting point, and we need to look at what's working with that law and move forward from there.
What do you think are the worst parts of the law?
Well, I think one of the things is that the opt-out provision allows people to opt out. In other words, when you sign into a website, there's going to be a little box there you can check, and that'll opt you out. But most people don't use that. Most people are just going to leave privacy settings the way they are. So we need something stronger. I think it's crucial that users know what data is being collected. They need to know how that data is being used, and they need to have some meaningful control of that. And it's clear to me from conversations and from polling and so on that consumers think they've lost control of their data. And my gosh, you know, I agree with them. They have lost control of their data. So much is being collected and so much is being used. Inferences are being made about people. And those are not only with regard to your financial well-being, but regard to prison reform, regard to how you rent a home or buy a home, your credit ratings. All these things are being predicated by information that they're gathering, and so this needs to be protected.
You know, when I was involved with helping to found New America in 1999, and there was this guy running around, he may be here today, Mark, if you're here, hello, named Mark Rodenberg. And some of you know he had a company, organization, I think it was called, excuse me if I get it wrong, the Electronic Privacy Information Center or something. And I would always see Mark at every high-tech meeting, and he was sort of considered by many tech people as the gadfly on privacy. for many, many years. But if you go back, as I did last night, and look at the things that Mark was warning about, almost all of them have become true. And so it raises an interesting question about how to get the equities right between industries, public interest, Congress, and it has taken us, so what is that, 20 years? 20 years ago, when Mark came on my radar screen, that we're now having the discussion he said we needed to have way back when. How do we, just as a legislator in the muck of all of this, do a better job? Because it seems to me that we're reacting as opposed to planning and being more strategic in these questions.
Well, I think you're right, but this question came up even in the 1940s and 1930s. The French philosophers, the postmodernists, were putting out the question, well, is government going to get enough information about us to control the way we're thinking and the way we're voting and the way we're acting? And I think that's a fear that we have now, and it's justifiable. So what we need to do is make sure that that data is protected on the one hand. I mean, there's a couple aspects here. You want to make sure that consumers know what data is being collected and how it's being used, but you also need to have security so that that data doesn't get broken into, so that cyber attacks don't get people access to that data. So we have a couple of very big challenges ahead of us in terms of being able to accomplish those goals.
Do you talk to your Republican compadres?
Oh, yes.
So you're one of those that will actually talk to people on the other side of the line.
Well, I mean, I have learned. Unfortunately, I mean, I think my ideas are better, of course, but we do need to work across the aisle. I mean, there are, the best legislation comes about when there's compromise on both sides, and that's where
I agree with you. It's strange to ask that question, but some do and some don't in these days. So knowing that, what is the temperature on getting a law around privacy and data? As you see it, I asked Mark Warner the same thing, and he surprised me with how optimistic he was that there was, in fact, a package that he thought a majority of the Senate, I think is what he implied, but it sounded like a good chunk of Republican senators. But how do you look at your House members? Would there be something there you could find common ground?
I think we will.
Somebody come fix my mic. Just walk up here and fix it.
It's going in out. There needs to be some compromise. That's for sure. I was a little taken back in the last year or so when the privacy protections and the data protections with the internet service providers was taken away by the Republican-led CRA that basically erased those protections. So I'm a little bit wary about where we're going to be able to go, but I think in the next Congress we've got some baseline ideas and we're going to move forward with those. One of the ideas I think that's so important is to give the Federal Trade Commission the authority to make rules regarding privacy. And I know that the Republicans are very resistant to giving agencies the power to do that. So I think that's one of the
just to come back to that on the FTC, which I agree has a good record for regulation and even enforcement. Is there a majority? Do you have enough Republicans in that who are in majority, at least right now, that you think something could pass?
Well, not right now. Obviously, the election is less than 2 months
not imminently, but look, whichever. I mean, the question is, regardless of the election. I mean, there's the question of in terms of the temperature of this issue, do you think in whatever Congress you're in, you're likely to find good Republicans?
Well, I'm optimistic in the sense that the American people feel very strongly that they've lost control of their data, and as long as that message gets out to legislators, they're going to be willing to act on that. So I take that as a positive message. I think the roadblock is the resistance of the Republicans to allow further regulation in any part of the market. So that's going to be our struggle.
How did the GDPR change the game from your perspective?
Well, the GDPR, along with the California Privacy Act, has brought industry to the table. Before that, as I mentioned, I think they were very resistant to taking steps to strengthen privacy rules. Now that they see that this is coming, they don't want a 50-state patchwork and so on. So they're willing to come to the table, and I think that's an important step.
Are you concerned by Google not showing up at Mark Warner's committee and, by his suggestion possibly not wanting to answer questions on China and censored searches?
I'm absolutely concerned about that. Google should have been willing to come to the table without subpoena or any other. I mean, we saw Dorsey and we saw Zuckerberg willing to come forward and testify. Those are long, hard days for those folks. Basically 10, 12 hours answering questions from hundreds of different people. So I have respect for that. And it's unfortunate that Google didn't participate.
You know, I know you sit in a privileged situation and know a lot more things about what nefarious behaviors are going on with foreign governments in our high-tech sector. What can you share with us that without getting yourself in trouble, that we don't know in the media?
Well, one of my areas of expertise is energy policy and electric grids, and I think what's happened.
How much foreign malware is in our grids?
That's the question we don't understand, and the problem is that the way the administration is acting, they're not allowing us to take the steps to understand what is going on in terms of foreign malware in our electrical system, in all of our infrastructure.
What does that mean? They're not allowing us to understand.
Well, as Mark Warner just said, the president fired the person that should have been in charge of that. He hasn't recreated that position, so we really don't have.
Is that the Tom Bossert job?
I don't want to name the name, but we don't have the resources in position to be able to discern what is actually happening with regard and to take the proper steps to protect ourselves.
Wow, that's interesting. That may be tweetable. Just, I guess, finally, you know, I was talking to Jack Dorsey recently of Twitter, who was in town, as we all know, and I raised this question of him on whether or not we are getting the equation wrong. Because as I think about it and I watch the tech companies and their growth, there's this weird notion right now that somehow a law, a regulation will fix everything. But I think when you look at the global dimension and the scale of these companies, they're so huge that I raised the question. I said, if you were us, if you were in the media looking at this, do we have a better chance of saving society and saving what we care about by influencing what you do? Or do we have a better chance of making ourselves more resilient in some ways to you, to Twitter, to whatever? And I'm interested in how you look at that. And he was intrigued with that dimensionality, that maybe a lot more of the locus is teaching people, having literacy on this issue and equipping people, educating them in a different way, you know, creating boot camps for people to understand what's out there. And I know that that's a heavy lift, but I'm just wondering if that discussion ever unfolds, because right now it's blame the tech companies mostly, or influence the tech companies that will solve this. And I guess I'm a cynic about that approach. You?
Well, let me say I have a tremendous respect for the idealism in Silicon Valley. Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Dorsey, or Jack Dorsey, excuse me.
Jack, yeah.
They came into this.
Better name.
Excuse me. They came into this really idealistic. They wanted to open up communication. They wanted to open up socialization, right, and so on. And it's created basically this huge machine. And I don't expect that corporations are going to act in the long term anyway, in the public interest without some sort of guidance from the federal government.
Interesting.
But to answer your other question, I think consumers need to be educated, need to educate themselves about what's happening with their data and their personal information.
Interesting. Let me open the floor questions and comments to Congressman McNerney. Yes, right here in the. Good morning.
Good morning. Steve Delbianco with NetChoice.
Yeah.
Congressman, President Trump loves the idea of new regulation. I think that just last week he called for laws to force Google search to suppress negative news so that positive news would flow up to the top page. Now, I know that you and Senator Warner are concerned about big tech, but aren't we all even more concerned about big government having the power to suppress negative news?
Great question. I mean, I think it can go both ways. So.
Oh, that's absolutely right. I think what he's suggesting would be go against the First Amendment. I mean, we have to have First Amendment rights. We have to allow people to communicate ideas on the internet. I think the difficulty becomes when it's hate speech, when it's speech or ideas that incite violence. Those are the kind of things that we need to be careful about. And I'm telling you, creating algorithms to ferret out hateful and violent suggesting tweets and information is going to be very, very difficult. We need to have the best minds, and we do have some of the best minds in the world working on that. So it's one of those cat and mouse issues. We're going to have to be fighting that forever.
Other questions, comments? Yes, in the back. Oh, I just saw your hand. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. We're in the front. You have a question? You look like you have a question. You don't. Well, then she does. Yeah. Comment, question? Let me ask you just a question, then I'm just going to go myself. If we've got, you guys are, we're going to turn this into a salon. Oh, we've got my friend from the Software Alliance here, right here, Carl. There you go. See, that's the price of me remembering your name from the reception. Yes, Carl.
Sure, thanks. So my name's Carl Schonander. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association, and thanks for putting together this event. I'd just like to follow up on the sort of First Amendment issues, access to publicly available information, which is really, really important for some of our member companies. There's some issues with the California law on that. You know, whatever, I would just say, it's more of a comment and interested in your reaction. Whatever emerges from the federal privacy law or whatever happens in the country, we've really got to get this right. We think in the GDPR context, it didn't get quite right in the context of right to be forgotten. So I would just point that out. That's really, really important to us. Thanks.
So if I can jump onto your part of the dimension of the GDPR law and the tension with publicly available information is the right to be forgotten, and what that does to your large data companies, and also gets down to something that people haven't talked about is what's an individual and who can do this. What's an individual versus a company, which the courts often treat as an individual. So have you worked through any of that yet?
We're just on the beginning of that. Basically, it takes a lot to know that. We're talking to stakeholders and commercial consumer privacy groups and so on. So I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge. But I think it's real because so much information is out there. You might have access to it. One of the things I found out when we had our hearings with Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey was that even the CEOs of these companies don't know exactly what data consumers has access to and how they can manage it. And so if the CEOs of these companies don't know what's going on, how can an average consumer know what's going on? So we need to be very proactive in terms of making sure that people know how to have access to their data and how to remove it and how to change it. If there's errors in it, I mean, they make inferences about you from the data. And if those inferences are wrong, can you have some way to change that information? So not only is the right to forget, but also how do you change information that's wrong? These are big questions that need thoughtful answers.
Congressman, I've been watching with some deep interest this issue of elections in Georgia and a primary race between two Republican contenders, and how the data management in a normal election, it was not a Democratic versus Republican race, was just so screwed up. And I understand election, politics may be a kind of a different game here, but it is also data. It's management. It's managing that data. It's the protection and the harbors around it. And I'm just wondering what, on a scale of 1 to 10, just as we wrap up here, in terms of getting the broader, in retrospect to that, and getting this right, where do you think we're likely to do? Are we going to end up with a data disaster over time, or do you think there's something genuinely doable and salvageable here?
No, I don't think it's going to be a data disaster, but we are muddling through this, and I think we're going to continue to muddle through it. What I'd love to see is the Federal Trade Commission, as I mentioned, their core mission is protecting consumers. So giving them rulemaking authority, giving them some civil penalty authority, and giving them the resources to actually carry out. I think that's the best way forward, and that's what my particular legislation does.
Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Jerry McNerney, thank you so much.
Thank you
for spending time. Good to see you, sir. Thank you.